Welcome to Inaudible. I'm your host, Jeremy Weiland, and I'm joined by my co-host, Nithin Reddy. On this podcast, we discuss the weird, beautiful channeled messages found in the long tradition of contact with the Confederation of planets in service to the one infinite creator. These messages articulate a philosophy of spiritual evolution popularly known as the Law of One. Many of these messages are available to listen to on our sister podcast, Living Love and Light, available on all platforms. We seek to provide analysis and commentary on this philosophy described in these messages, identifying the common themes and grappling with the application of this information to our human lives. However, we are not counselors, gurus, or experts of any kind, so please evaluate our words in light of our shortcomings and use your own best judgment. Thanks for listening, and welcome, listeners. Welcome, Nithin. How you doing?
Doing well, man. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm just it's gotten cold here in Richmond, Virginia. We had our first light dusting of snow recently, so I'm just dealing with the change in weather. And my wife is camping tonight, so she's in the mountains where it's cold. So I'm just taking care of the dogs and holding up the fort, all that stuff.
Nice, nice. I can say that it's gotten colder here in SoCal too, but not as cold as Virginia. Cold here, Riverside is probably like low 50s at night, so yeah,
Yeah,
it's cold. You have to wear a
yeah,
jacket.
yeah. Well, you got that. It's a lot drier out there than it is here out east with all our humidity and stuff like that. So when it's wet and cold, oh my God, it just sinks down into your bones, I feel like.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, today's episode we want to do on the subject of addiction. Um, it's something that I think everybody in some sense has dealt with because it has to do with, in my view, the specific nature of our second density brains, how they connect to our mind complex, and kind of how we think about comfort, pleasure, pursuing our desire, and how we get fixated on things that sort of simplify that. When really our pursuit of our desire in the spiritual sense is a much broader and more subtle thing. And there's all sorts of addictions, right? So there's lots of different ways that we can go with this.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like addictions are such a big part of destructive behaviors in life and in society, and at least here in the U.S., it's a growing problem, probably in terms of specifically drug addictions. Although, as you mentioned, it does extend far beyond drugs. Um, so yeah, there's kind of like maybe four different areas I thought it would be useful to go over. And to be fair to listeners, we've touched upon the topic of drug addiction and addictive behaviors in a variety of other podcasts, but I don't think we had a dedicated one just kind of focusing on it. So I thought it'd be useful to kind of go into this area. So with respect to maybe how we're going to cover this topic for today, I thought it was useful, although Jeremy, you basically already gave a definition. It's kind of useful to maybe define what we mean by addiction, and maybe the definition is already given in part or whole in some of the channeled material. But in general, what do we mean when we say addiction? And the second area I think it'd be useful to go over is how do we interact with addiction, or the different ways we can interact with addiction, both addictive behaviors or addiction within ourselves and with other selves. The third area being how does addiction interact with polarization, and also the sinkhole of indifference. And then the fourth area being, other important points we wanted to share and just takeaways on the topic that we think it's useful to give each other and the listener.
So, Nithin, what is the legal definition of addiction?
I don't know if there's a legal definition. I think actually the few times it comes up, it's up for the jury to decide what that term means.
I mean,
It's usually not.
does it even enter into legal decisions? Like,
So
it's just about whether they commit the crime or not, right?
So there is one weird statute that makes it a more serious crime to possess like an unregistered firearm while you're addicted to a controlled substance.
With that
So
addiction being some sort of medical determination?
I think you can call in expert testimonies, but it's ultimately a jury that the fact will the fact that the jury will decide. So it's kind of weird.
Yeah. I was just wondering, since you have a legal background. So do we want to start with like talking about what we mean by addiction?
Yeah, and see if there's any guidance in the material. I think there's at least some tidbits that are helpful in kind of thinking about addiction. But do you want to kind of start us off and expand on what you were saying
I,
earlier?
I can talk about how I approach addiction.
Yeah,
And it has to do with it not in this clinical or legal or any sense, but just as a dynamic of behavior. Because I think in my opinion, what we call addiction is the sort of misallocation of habit. When we build habits that reinforce what we truly want in ourselves, that reflect our deepest desires, um, those can constrain us too. Those can limit us from a full range of choices and actions we might take. But that's considered good because it's driving us down the path of what it is that we desire to obtain. And so that just sounds like discipline, right? Like
right,
habits are kind of like when habits are good, it's discipline. When habits are bad, it's kind of like a inverse of discipline, right? It's like discipline honed to some other kind of lurking imbalanced desire in us, something that we are conflicted about. Of course, drugs and alcohol are one means by which we form habits of seeking pleasure by these things. But it can also be sex. It can be all kinds of behaviors, things that tend to cause us to fixate. And it's that fixation, that inability to think broadly about something, but you keep going down this narrow mental path whenever you have a need, whenever you have a lack that you feel. That kind of indicates it to me. What about you?
no, I think that's a useful way to put it. Um, in terms of addiction, I think it's useful to break down what we mean by addiction into two areas: the external manifestations, or what you do externally when you're addicted, and the internal motivations. So, with respect to external motivations, you can have something, generally speaking, external behavior, even if it seems like it's helping the person or helping others. Theoretically, it can still be from an addictive mindset. So, like for example, it's important to be healthy, right? It's important to be maybe go to the gym or get some exercise, and certainly people can do that. Two different people might do the exact same exercise routine, but one might do it from an addictive internal motivation, and I'll talk about what I mean by that. And the other one might do it more from a very much more motivated by like love and uh, more balanced, undistorted, disciplinary approach to doing that. So what they do, what you see externally, the repetitive behavior, as you said, addiction is usually associated with stuff that's externally bad, but not always. You can have seemingly good behavior, like going to the gym repeatedly, that actually can stem from an internal kind of perspective of addiction. But certainly, if someone's like, on the street shooting up, getting needles, they probably don't have a good internal motivation. So the reverse is also true, but in general, it's the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But in general, if they're doing something bad on the outside, I think it would be more difficult to find someone who's not motivated internally by an addictive mindset, right? Such as getting high on the street, shooting up with needles. I think it would be very hard to get to that place out of a
Yeah.
place of discipline and love, right? So there's a feedback kind of process taking place, that the external behavior, if it's obviously and overtly bad, it's more likely to stem from an addictive behavior. But if the external behavior is good, it may or may not stem from an addictive behavior, if that makes sense. Um, with respect to kind of the internal motivation, it Ra talks about this a little bit in how um, the different polarities interact with internal catalyst. Like, for example, specifically, I think this is an analogy to be sure, but specifically, Raw talks about how the positive entity will recognize anger, for example, and recognize the chaotic nature of anger and accept it. Whereas a negative entity will also recognize the nature of anger, but instead of trying to accept it, use it specifically in situations to give it better power over other selves, right? So the way I see addictive behavior is it's kind of a configuration where probably the defining characteristic is that you feel an insatiable desire for it. And there's specifically a Raw quote on desire and insatiability. But before I get to those, is there anything else you wanted to add or talk about when we were talking about what we mean by the term addiction? So I didn't get a chance to look at non-Raw channeling. Does Quo or any other Confederation contact kind of speak to the definition of addiction, so to speak?
There's a Hatan from February 13th, 1983, that talks about addiction more as a general dynamic. So when we say addiction, what I was trying to establish before is like addiction is the pejorative sense of habit, whereas discipline is the positive sense of habit. But, you can throw addiction around to make a big point about habits in general. In this session, Hatan, I'll just read a few parts. Hatan says, "You see, my friends, the search for truth is like the addiction, which is in this instrument's mind as the topic of conversation before the meetings. You become addicted to the joy of being whole. This enables you to do a great deal of work, for there are no sales on truth. You will not find it cheaply. There are not bargain days, and any who promises will be promising speedy happiness and speedy despair. There are no gimmicks. There are no shortcuts. There are simply glimpses of the utmost joy, feelings of going into another world where all is as beautiful as a thought that you have just had." What I find interesting about this is that they're talking about this way in which desire and the search for this joy pulls us along. And if we're not careful, if we use our minds to identify that joy with something material or some behavior or something that is tangible, so we just keep going for that tangible thing rather than the thing it actually is trying to point to, the thing that's trying to represent, then I think that's where we get mixed up. The wonderful thing about, let's be crass, being addicted to meditation, being addicted to the search for the creator, is that the feedback, the reinforcement that it gives you is constantly driving you deeper and deeper into yourself. And these questions about what it is I desire, what it is that joy means, what it is that I'm actually seeking, get pulled into deeper and starker relief, so that as one is pulled along by this desire, one learns to deepen the desire and to understand the self better through it. Now, I don't think that describes being addicted to heroin. I guess in a sense, being addicted to anything, even things that we would call quote, quote, bad, do teach you about yourself. It's not true that there's no learning that comes from addiction, even the kind that we would not wish on somebody or ourselves. But at the same time, one of the great things about the search for the creator in our lives, in our minds and hearts, is that it really pulls us into this deeper relationship with our own selves. And at the end of the day, we're stuck with that. And it's no bad thing to be addicted to that search for the self.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with the kind of how we're using the word addiction. I was maybe when I was kind of defining it, I was putting a more of a clinical definition. But
Right.
if we kind of make it broader, that it's just this insatiable desire, because I thought about just simplifying the definition of addiction into just insatiable desire, and I think to a certain sense, that's kind of the Hatan quote you read here, and that is also consistent a little bit with Raw's kind of discussion of desire, and I think it makes sense as well. Um, Everything is service, right?
Yeah.
And certainly some of the paths back to the creator are longer than others. Um, just I just want to note my personal secondhand experiences, I guess you could say, with addiction, because I work with a lot of people who, suffer from addiction, recovering addicts, and things of that nature. People who are starting the addictive process, people who are in the throes of it, and then people who are trying to get clean, and then people who have gotten clean. And what's interesting is that almost always, because we have to do a deep dive, right, in criminal court, and people want help. There's they try to dig into what's causing it. There's reports to read and stuff like that. Usually it's almost always some sort of like trauma that's unprocessed. And that's how the addiction kind of starts. It's like a way of self-medicating the pain away. But what's really interesting is that you talk to addicts, and they'll say, they won't describe it as avoiding pain always. Sometimes they'll say it was avoiding pain, right? But they'll often describe it as it just felt so good. Like it's almost like, right? So in a certain sense, pain and pleasure are it's a polarity scale, right?
Yeah, they're on a continuum. Yep.
It's on a continuum. So when you typically talk to people, they don't acknowledge their baseline level of pain. A lot of these addicts, until they get a lot of insight into their trauma early in the process, and while they're in the throes of it, they just say, I like the way it makes me feel. Like it feels so good, without realizing, no, it's just that you feel horrible because of unprocessed stuff while sober, right?
Yep.
It's like you're going from negative to neutral, whereas they see it as they're going from neutral to positive. And maybe it's a subtle distinction, but it's not a subtle distinction in terms of using where you are, where your baseline is, as an indicator as to whether something's bothering you. And I see this also in the other like commonplace emotional polarity scale of like stress and relaxation. A lot of people don't realize their baseline is stressed, for whatever you want to call it, and they probably only get to what I would consider just normal state of relaxation. Forget meditative relaxation, a normal state of relaxation, where they're on vacation and they put away their work phone, right? So it's like their baseline is already different. So the reason I mention that is that, and I think we've all had contact with some people who have had problems with addiction.
Yeah.
Is that the more and more a person does the addictive behavior, whatever it might be, they will typically start to realize it doesn't make them feel good anymore, but they're still drawn to it. Bingo. And you can explain it away chemically, saying they get less of a high, but I also wonder if they're just starting to realize their baseline was always pretty bad. And they're just getting more in touch with the fact that their baseline is just bad. And doing the drug makes them feel more normal. And what's really interesting is that, just to kind of summarize this, and the reason I think it's useful is that people who are in the throes of addiction, inevitably, because all these things cost money, all addictive behaviors end up costing time or money, whether they're drugs or something else. And people who are really, really addicted to something, they end up sacrificing something. And at first, maybe they sell their assets. But usually what ends up happening is, if they don't want to get clean, they're still doing these addictive behaviors. And they're, for some people, they can keep these addictive behaviors to a small extent and still hold down a job. But other people, they just go completely into it, right? And for those who go completely into it, what I've noticed is it manifests as seemingly outwardly a service to self philosophy, where they sacrifice everything. I've had drug addicts tell me, usually this is after they got clean, like they would literally sell clothes that their 3-year-old daughter was gifted, so that their 3-year-old daughter didn't have like shoes or like more winter clothing, to get high. Like, and so it's like the pinnacle of selfishness. Now, internally, right, I think Ra talks about this, Confederation material talks about this, you can't actually know the internal polarity of any externally manifested action, right? Like, you don't know what's actually going on. But from an outward perspective, it seems like it's priming them to not care about doing these very selfish activities, And then what's also interesting is when people typically get clean, they become very positive a lot of times, and so it's an interesting dichotomy about how this entire process of addiction works.
Because I think that's because they have felt trapped by their to me it almost feels like the pleasure that you're seeking, that short-term pleasure that you're seeking, whatever behavior or drug or whatever that you're pursuing, it like you need to be free of the lack of imagination that you could ever feel that good without that, or that you could ever be happy without that, right? Uh, you feel some lack within yourself, something missing, and you're trying to fill that. And if you can't fill it with something that will satisfy you in the long run, which is, I think, the healthier way of dealing with habits, where you build habits that reinforce you both in the short-term feedback loop and over the long term, right? You're just in this short-term chasing cycle of getting a dopamine rush. Kuo talks about this in a January 7th, 2017 session. They say, the sense of being addicted to any quality, concept, or activity is that feeling within one's being that there is some lack of that which is necessary for the life to be felt as whole, as perfect, as the way it should be. This is usually because of a blockage in one of the energy centers that has become activated as a result of catalysts that you have chosen yourself to experience in order to free yourself of that which you call addiction. In other words, like, it's important to recognize that addiction is a form of catalysis. It is designed to expose something that you need to understand about yourself. But I think for us, it's really scary sometimes to see people in the deep throes of addiction, because it seems like, if I look at somebody who's just strung out on the street, I'm just like that, if I were in his shoes, I would give up. Like, I don't know if I would have the strength to pull it out. And many do give up. Many die in despair like that, and it's horrible and sad. But you're right, there are also people who do pull themselves up, and they're stronger and often much more loving as a result. And that goes for all kinds of addictions, right?
Absolutely. And just to follow up on that quote from Quo, Raw in session 32, question 2, um, the questioner is specifically asking about sexual polarity and catalyst, and specifically orange or yellow ray. And Raw talks about here near the end the usual nature of sexual interaction, if one is yellow or orange ray in the primary vibratory patterns, is one of blockage and then insatiable hunger due to the blockage. When there are two cells vibrating in this area, the potential for polarization through sexual interaction is begun. One entity experiencing the pleasure of humiliation and slavery or bondage, the other experiencing the pleasure of mastery and control over another entity. In this way, a sexual energy transfer of a negative polarity is experienced. So what's interesting is that it's talking obviously about sexual insatiability or maybe some sort of sexual addiction. But here it's specifically saying that blockage can actually give way to negative polarization. So it's not all
Yeah.
blockages result in sinkhole of indifference. So it's fascinating in that sense, you know?
No, I totally agree with you. In my notes, I have a connection between the sinkhole of indifference and the search for comfort that addiction represents. But I think you're actually right. I don't think it's the same thing as just being static in the sinkhole. It's almost like, you know what it's almost like? It's almost like a desperation to stay in the sinkhole. It's like catalyst is pulling you out of the sinkhole. It's forcing you to make a polarized choice. And you're trying like hell to stay in that
Yeah.
sinkhole, to stay in that comfortable, warm cocoon of whatever behavior or drug or whatever that you're in, so that you don't have, because look, polarization, I think we all feel deeply within that once you start to truly polarized, you are committed to the path, whatever path that is, that's when the tough stuff really starts. It's when you really have to face yourself. And I think I think we have all had aversions to that at some point. I know I have. I
Yeah.
it nothing has taught me about that aversion so much as doing meditation every morning. Because when do I least want to meditate? When I need to do it the most, when I have the most blockage, the most turmoil in my life, and I would benefit the most from that calm ability to reflect on it, or just to experience myself at my core basic level. And then that's where like new patterns of thought, new strategies, new approaches to my life can actually creatively emerge. But as long as I'm not affording myself that ability to reflect like that and to give myself a chance to pull out of it, I'm going to stay stuck because I'm wanting to avoid it. It's easier to just kind of do a little bit of suffering in silence indefinitely rather than risk a great deal of suffering by actually looking at yourself, you know?
Yeah, so it's interesting in that the sinkhole of indifference is definitely, you can be there for many different reasons, right? I think avoiding catalyst is a part of it, but there's many other reasons, right? Like you can have distorted beliefs. Well, we call them distorted, but holdovers from second density, right? Like like the tribal mentality, the pack mentality, that Ross specifically says it's without polarity to hold over from second density. But if that's like your primary motivator and that's what you focus your entire life like morality around, you're probably not going to polarize because you're going to be stuck in that second density thinking, right? But what's interesting is when it comes to the sinkhole of indifference, because you're trying to follow comfort, it's interesting in the sense that it's exactly as you said, the more desperate you get to hold on to comfort, it's like the catalyst builds upon itself, right? The catalyst of addiction builds upon it grows bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's almost like it tends to pull you out, you know?
Yeah.
It tends to pull you out.
You have to exert
to
exert all the more effort, continuously more effort, to get that modicum of comfort. That first time you used the drug or the first time you had that experience or that behavior was so obvious and so plentiful. In fact, that's how I usually think about my addictive behaviors. And they talk about, chasing the dragon, right? It's, for example, with me, it's sometimes I can find these sort of addictive behaviors with a food. For example, I have some food for the first time and it blows me away. And all I can think about after that is wanting that food again. And each time I have it again, it hits less and less hard, right? It's less and less tasty. It fills that hole less and less. And that pursuit, and the more that I try to align all of my efforts to pursue it, and I get less and less feedback, it's almost like the experience itself is weaning me off of the fixation.
Exactly. And, there's one raw quote on desire that I think sometimes I've seen others maybe misunderstand it a little bit. So this is session 18, question 5. So it's interesting. The question, actually, I'll just read the question because it's a question that I think a lot of people think about. Much of the mystic tradition of seeking on earth holds the belief that the individual self must be erased or obliterated and the material world ignored for an entity to reach nirvana, as it's called, or enlightenment. What is the proper role of the individual self and its worldly activities in aiding an entity to grow more into the law of one? I am Ra. The proper role of the entity is in this density to experience all things desired, to then analyze, understand, and accept these experiences, distilling from them the love light within them. Nothing shall be overcome. That which is not needed falls away. This orientation develops due to the analysis of desire. And then it kind of talks on and on that it's unwise to overcome. Is that overcoming is an imbalanced action, creating difficulties in balancing in the time-space continuum. So it's interesting because it kind of begs the question a little bit in that the proper role of this entity is in this density to experience all things desired. And I think I've touched upon this before. In my opinion, you can't you don't know what you truly desire unless you're willing to be extremely um, like self-honest and have a great amount of like self-honesty. So I often say this, right? Like, and I've I've actually had discussions about this, and we might have covered in a previous podcast, that the Blu-ray is way more about surface level, is way deeper than just mere surface level honesty. Like lying and falsity might be one end of the polarity, but honesty isn't the exact same thing as truth. And the other end of the polarity of the spectrum of falsity and lying is truth. Mere honesty is not enough. So what I mean by that is this. Let's say you're a person who um, you're not very self-aware, or maybe you're very self-aware. Maybe someone like one of us, and we're just having a really bad day, bad week, bad month. And we've had a lot of unprocessed catalysts as we come into work. And our coworker just asks some innocent question, but maybe they do it in a tone of voice, or maybe they ramble on a little bit longer, and you just get frustrated. And you're like, "Look, can't you just like my time is important? Can't you just you lash at them a little bit? You're like, look, you're so annoying. You're taking 10 minutes to ask like a 5-second question. This is a completely made up example. I don't think I've ever done this. So, and then you say what's on your mind. You're like, look, I think that if you were just more concise, you'd get along with others better in the workplace. When you say that, you might be practicing surface level honesty. That's what your mind actually thinks at the surface level, at the highest level of consciousness, or not the highest level, but the most surface level. But if you had actually been doing the daily practice, the contemplation, like maybe you're upset because your mother has cancer and that's really bothering you, and it's really making your mood at work really bad. If you had done that practice of self-honesty and done the contemplation, you would have realized that your anger has nothing to do with the person asking the question. So just like truth is deeper than surface level honesty, desire is, in my opinion, the spiritual desire. What Ra is talking about here, to experience all things desired, to analyze, understand, accept these experiences. It's not surface level desire, right? Like, I think, without getting into too much trouble, I think at least as guys, we understand this, that you can be in a committed relationship, but sometimes you can't control like a ephemeral, momentary surface level thought about, hey, someone else is attractive, right?
Right.
But that's not your truth. That's not what you truly desire. It's just a surface level thing. It's almost like this understanding that there's a 2D animal that we live with that is like our lizard-like brain that lashes out, that has sexual desires even or attraction, even though we're in a committed relationship and we have no true desire to cheat or step out. So it's this understanding that true desire and true truth come from knowing oneself. And it's not just like, oh, at the time it seemed like a good idea, or at the time this is what my ego or very primal part of my brain believed.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's what I think is really interesting from this spiritual point of view is the way that repression works within us. Because what happens is these energies that we are repressing find their outlet in some way. And I think in this surface level honesty, what you're articulating is the way that we can allow for the release of the pressure that's building up within without it being the true confrontation of that thing within, the actual thing within. It's just letting off some of the pressure, some of the force, and we feel like even in conflict, we can feel very rewarded by that. We can feel rewarded and relieved by letting that pressure out. And it's not bad to relieve the pressure, except to the extent that it has impacts on other people that are negative. The point of having a spiritual discipline that you work at on a regular basis is so you're constantly having this confrontation with these things within yourself that you may not really like, that you may not really want to face, and yet you still bring yourself honestly and tenderly and gingerly to the task of facing yourself, accepting yourself, and then moving on. Right. So that then when these pressures do find the release, they're not coming at you from sideways. They're not coming out of nowhere. You have a decent grasp of the full 360-degree nature of yourself. It's about recognizing that you are a complete and total self, and therefore you have to be in charge of that full and total self, and not just the parts that you want to represent. There was a quote from March 7th, 2004, that talked about this in the context of addiction. It might be useful to read this. Kuo says, "We would suggest that if one may take a step back from a specific codependency or addiction that is specifically geared to one person," maybe in this case, Kuo is talking about codependency, but they're conflating it with addiction. Being dependent on a person would probably be the same thing if it goes to a negative part, right? Okay, anyway, they say one may perhaps see that in each incarnational pattern, there is that tendency to divide the self into the good self and the bad self, the light self and the dark self, the peaceful self and the disturbed self, and so forth, creating out of a universal and infinitely graded being with no seam or rip in the makeup of that being, a being that has separations and isolations of parts of the self from other parts of the self, so that there seems to be more going on, shall we say, than in truth there really is. It is so endemic to your peoples that we would suggest that instead of the term codependency, one may perhaps think more generally in terms of addictions. For the addiction to pain is no more of a puzzle than the addiction to any substance that one begins to see as not being helpful for the self. Why would entities with good sense and good balance choose to inculcate within the self a continuance of pain in order to feel more alive? It is simply because it is observed. It is simply because it is the observed method upon your planet and the culture in which you enjoy living for entities to embrace those things which are destructive, such as overwork, a dependence on substances, and other imbalances, because they seem to be appropriate and even necessary for the functioning of the organism and the being, in the job, in the family, and in the environment. The habit of looking outward for meaning, of depending upon ideas, people, or things for a feeling of rightness and a sense of meaning, is that which has been accepted among your peoples as the appropriate way of behaving and thinking. I don't think I could have picked a kuho that reinforced what you just said better than that. It is insane because we are looking outside for something that we're afraid to look for within ourselves. And it's that inner lack that we need to fill.
And I love this quote because it specifically talks about something that I was going to raise. So all of us have many addictive behaviors, but I wanted to give an example of one behavior that I've gotten better about. But it's amazing how obvious it is to me it's an addiction. When I'm really stressed out about some work, and I think I've mentioned this before, I don't know if we mentioned on the podcast, when I'm really stressed out about something that I'm working on, one moment usually it's because I'm right there like at the computer working on it, right? But I'm talking about like super stressed. I'm so stressed and I can feel it and I know it. I'll just basically teleport. Like I won't physically teleport, but like I'm just thinking, man, I'm so stressed. And then this has happened multiple times. Next thing I know, I'm at the fridge with the door open.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, and I'm like, I recognize it now. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? And in my mind, I'm actually thinking about the work, but it's like my body somehow just brought me to the fridge. And like, there's a part of my mind looking for some food. And I'm like, holy moly, this is not good. And now I've, I use it as a sign to help me, transform my approach to work. And, I think I've talked about this before, that for me, it was being less, slave driving towards my own work and be like, look, you can be disciplined about work. And you can also say, look, if you really, really, really need to take a break and not work late today, it's okay. And you just give yourself that opportunity. You usually won't even take it. But just having, like, that's one of many techniques, right? So why I love this is that I feel like low-key, repeatedly, multiple Confederation sources have told us that one of the biggest stumbling blocks to people evolving on planet Earth is our work culture. Like Ra has specifically called out, saying it is very difficult to polarize when you're working from dawn to dusk, or which is only dawn to dusk is only usually 12 hours on average, right? Depending on the time of year and stuff like that, where you
Yeah.
are on the planet. But even that, Raw's saying like, you know, that's way, way, way too much. And given that we have an 8-hour workday, but then we also have commute time, we're pretty close to that whole, working 10, 12 hours, or at least not having a chance to be at home contemplating due to the commute, due to working 8 hours plus the commute, right? A lot of people, we have jobs, right? But how many people who are on lower income have to work more than 40 hours, multiple jobs, right? How many people who are higher income are salaried at 40 hours, but they never, because it's a salary, you're usually working on average way more than 40 hours, right?
Right.
So
Yep.
but I mean, it's like, it's so ingrained in our society, right? Like parents, family members, spouses, even friends. I feel like most everyone I know in their 20s accepted that this was just how work was going to be, and did not start questioning this until they started having a family, until they started having other things that made them perhaps polarize more positively and realize, look, there's more to life than just amassing wealth and power through job.
Yeah. And I agree with you that it is often only when one has the time and space to truly and safely reflect upon one's life that you'll even see these patterns at all. For most people who overwork, they're just that has become who they are. They don't
They're addicted to it.
recognize, yes, and they don't recognize that how much their need for that is a trap, and it prevents them from the very thing that they think work is giving them. It becomes this habit, and it becomes this inability to really think creatively and outside of the box about your own life. And so you're not really in charge of it. Your life is living you rather than you living your life.
And to be fair, it's not merely just a cultural belief. The overwork is interwoven into, I think, the planetary consciousness, because a big part of it is like, especially if you're lower income, but even if you're not lower income, survival fear is often at the base of much of the overwork. And the reason I say that is that
Oh
it's
yeah.
very directly part of overworking if you are working two jobs and you're low income and you just need to do it, right? But think about it. Why do we as a country care about having a higher GDP, being more productive? Because ultimately it comes back to not just prosperity in general, but it comes back to that allows us to have a stronger military, right? Have a stronger country, which, because we need to. If we don't fund the military, spend all this money on, um, securing our borders and everything, we are afraid that we won't be able to survive. It's basically a survival fear, right?
Yeah. I think there's been studies done that show that under feudalism in the Middle Ages, people actually
Mm-hmm.
worked less than we work now.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for that may be that what it took to make them comfortable and satisfied, their entire idea of what the horizon of pleasure was, is so much simpler than what we have now. Now we can't be happy unless we have internet, we have electricity, we have TV, we have phone, we have a huge McMansion. We go on vacation a lot. Those things definitely do give some small amount of pleasure. There's no doubt about that. But it's not that holistic pleasure that we're really seeking, that I think
Right.
sometimes in simpler, more idyllic times was easier it took less imagination to get there. It took less work to get there for sure. And one could just be happy. And I will say also that in working less, you have more time for contemplation. But remember, at that time, you didn't have the total
Right.
marketization of all aspects of life like we do now. I try so hard to keep politics out of this podcast, but I think in this aspect, it really is true. You had a more overarching idea of what the good life was that was grounded in something that at least approached spirituality. And a lot of our work and a lot of our need to fill the hole inside comes from our general culture's inability to have something on the order of the spiritual that past people had.
Absolutely. And
There,
and I
there's
think
a Go ahead.
so. No, you and I think I'm so glad you mentioned that, because when I said survival, it is more broadly red ray. So it's your daily life. Like, what does that look like? Can you enjoy it? And a lot of times, all those things that you mentioned that we see as necessities today for our daily life and daily enjoyment, they weren't at all necessary. And
Right.
Ron and other Confederation sources talk about how our gadgets, that don't involve other selves, are typically just distractions, right? Because they don't really activate. They're solo gadgets. So, um, and look, I'm not saying you should never play like a video game or have a gadget, but understand that this is not something that, if it's used in abundance, that's conducive to spiritual growth, right? Because if you're playing a video game that doesn't involve anyone else, that's not going to activate the yellow ray. Maybe if it's a great story, well written, it can activate a lot of the energy centers. Like if there's a narrative to it, like reading a novel almost. But if it's just like an action oriented game where it's just like maybe something where you're not using your mind at all, there's no story to it, there's no, if you're not interacting with others, there's no multiplayer aspect, it's not going to activate any of your rays, except maybe the red, right? It's going to be red, and maybe orange, in that like you're trying to beat your own high score or something. But it's interesting in that a lot of these electronic things, a lot of the electronic devices we have, and even certain, I would say, like certain television shows, depending on what the show is, there probably isn't a lot of yellow ray activation by watching people. Some of them will have that, but some won't, right? It'll just be like mere entertainment. So it's absolutely true.
With the gadgets in particular, you see how technology can insinuate itself deeply into the habitual nature of our minds. How many of us, first thing when we wake up, reach for our phones? Mm-hmm. How many of us, when we're waiting in line or whatever, what do? We reach for our phones. And it's just coming. This is just not something that other cultures had to deal with. It just didn't have to deal with this as much. There might have been addictions to other things, but we have such a plethora of them. And frankly, it isn't unless you get that leisure time that we were talking about earlier that you even have the ability to reflect on these things, unless some trauma or some hardship happens that forces you to do that.
Right.
And I really do think that you nailed it when you were talking about the work culture, because I think that work culture came into view very much as a kind of cultural attachment or honoring of a spiritual life went away around the 19th century as capitalism came into view. I don't want to go on an anti-capitalism rant, but I'm just saying, like, it's interesting how, as Nietzsche put it, we killed God in the 19th century, and what has replaced it? Nothing so far. David Foster Wallace, an author who was writing when I was in high school, he wrote like Infinite Jest and stuff like that. He gave a commencement address at some school, and he gave a speech that really made an impact on me, and it talks a lot about this. And he says, everybody worships. And when we talk about worship and you talk about an addiction, I feel like those are somewhat similar things, because it's a striving towards something, right? Mm-hmm. It's a striving that you do out of a recognition of your own lack. We strive towards God because we recognize that's where our fulfillment is. Anyway, everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan mother goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some intangible set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, bromides, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. Worship power, you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. The insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful. It is that they are unconscious. They are default settings. They're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings, because the world of men and money and power hums along quite nicely on the fuel of fear and contempt and frustration and craving and the worship of self. Our own present culture has harnessed these forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and personal freedom. The freedom to be lords of our own tiny skull-sized kingdoms, alone at the center of all creation. This kind of freedom has much to recommend it, but there are all different kinds of freedom, and the kind that is most precious you will not hear much talked about in the great outside world of winning and achieving and displaying. The real important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and effort, and being able to truly care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty, little, unsexy ways every day. That is real freedom. The alternative is unconsciousness, the default setting, the rat race, the constant, gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. Yeah, I
Well
know a
said.
lot of people have criticisms of his writing, but that just blew me away when I first read that, because it nails it. And it doesn't have to be some like specific political economic criticism of our social system or economic system or anything like that. It's just these ways in which we use our minds to fixate on things instead of paying dang attention and waking up.
Yeah, in a certain sense, it's a reluctance to be responsible for kind of your spiritual growth to a certain extent.
Yeah, it's total freedom that we have now that we're released from the tyranny of the church, we're released from the tyranny of the king, right? We have this freedom, and what do we do with this freedom? That's the question. What do we do with this freedom? And
Yeah,
like he's saying, like that workaday world that you talk about, it's going to reinforce a certain concept of freedom. And we're the ones who have to decide when we go deep within, do we think that's freedom? Or would we rather exercise the agency that we have to understand a different kind of freedom? You know, it's kind of like, Jesus saying, take on my yoke, carry my burden, my yoke is light. It's because once you get out of your own dang head and your own gnawing desires and your own, oh, I crave this and I want that, and you start thinking out about what's going on outside of you. What are the other selves out there, the other me's that have needs and also are just like me? How can serving them, if nothing else, it gets you out of this need to always be like serving yourself, and like the you never can serve yourself enough. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Now, I think that on the genuine polarized serve the self path, that's turned into a source of power. That
right.
inability to ever exhaust the hunger becomes a way to be able to focus power very squarely and strongly. But if we're positing service to if we're polarizing service to others, that's not what we want. That is always going to drag us back into the sinkhole, where it's
Right.
just going to be about getting to a neutral place of comfort where we don't ever have to be disturbed, and our freedom will be to sit in our couches and watch TV while we eat popcorn and smoke weed.
Yeah, it's almost like people who do addictive behaviors because, often because there's some trauma that they don't want to. I think at some level they just don't want to or don't feel like they're able to heal it. And when I say they don't want to or they're not able to, it's from the perspective of they just want it gone. Like they just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to be a human being that has to process and deal with the trauma. They just want it gone, right? And the drugs will take it away. And the reason I've mentioned this point is that there's a sense of, maybe there's certainly a sense of victimhood. I find that in my interactions, but it's a sense of they just don't want to engage with the third density experience of processing catalysts, if this, for whatever catalyst that causes them to do these addictive behaviors, right? And the reason I mention that is that I see this a lot in some of my cases, and I want to ask and I think I've asked you off the air about this, but I want to ask you on the air about this. I've seen cases, and I've also seen people in real life, and I'm sure you have too, that they will be quote blackout, but they'll be blackout under the influence, completely aware, like not half asleep, right?
Yeah.
Usually it's a mix of stimulants with depressants, or sometimes that's just alcohol, and they just have such a high tolerance that they won't be like asleep. They'll be blackout and doing stuff. And I wonder, is that related to their overall kind of desire to not like engage or deal with stuff? Because a lot of these times, maybe sometimes they're lying about being blackout, but other times I truly believe that they don't remember anything, even though they look pretty. I mean, they looked under the influence, but they looked aware, like not like half asleep and doing stuff. You know?
I think it's this. I think it. When you confront those things that you don't like about yourself, it's not necessarily a simple thing. It's a very nuanced, tangled system of energy distortions, of ideas, of half thoughts that have been buried, maybe traumas that have not been like really looked at, and therefore it takes a lot of effort. There's some complexity involved in untangling all of this. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just take a pill? Wouldn't it be nice if we could just sleep with someone or binge on a gallon of ice cream? That's much simpler. And it becomes this kind of totem. The behavior or the drug, whether it becomes kind of totem. If I have this, I'm okay. Regardless of all this other stuff that's inside me, if I have this, I can go on to the next day. It's this fixation and this reduction of the complexity to the single thing. And it makes it easier to kind of like pull ourselves along rather, we can let this thing move us through our lives without really paying attention, without really being aware completely, because it's painful and it takes effort and it's not easy. And it's exactly what I was talking about before, where I tend to try to avoid meditation and have an aversion to reflection at the very moment that I need it the most, right?
I'm the exact same way. So I totally understand.
These are the things that you find out about yourself when you put a daily meditation regimen in place. You start seeing when you want to meditate and when you don't. And it tells you something about yourself. And frankly, the addictive behaviors that we talked about, even the really destructive ones, are telling people something about themselves. But look, in order for communication to occur, for the message to be received, you have to be paying attention. And there is a sense in which a lot of these addictive behaviors become distractions. A distraction is a simple thing we can fixate on, so we don't have to deal with the panoply of different tangled webs of energy, ideas, all that stuff that really we need to sift through. And here's the thing. We will get there. We will sift through all this stuff one way or another. There's an infinite amount of time in this universe. So that was one of the things that really helped me break some of my habits, is when I realized, I'm the only one that's holding me up,
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. But specifically, because I'm still trying to understand those whole blackout phenomenon that happens more with actual substances and addictive behavior. It won't happen when you're binging on a gallon of ice cream.
Sorry, I kind of pulled away from that point because I didn't really quite understand what you meant by this. Where you're going.
I've just noticed patterns, like when people black out, they'll typically, maybe it's just mere amnesia, but there's characteristics to blacking out that seem very common, and to seem to imply that there's something maybe a bit more substantial taking place other than mere loss of memory. Usually what I've noticed is that the person who blacks out, they'll do something that's typically not characteristic of their personality. It won't just be like, oh, it's Joe, he just blacked out and he was just Joe. Typically it's blacked out Joe is different, right, than sober, very, very different than sober Joe in terms of a lot of things.
one of the qualities of drugs or alcohol or some substance is that, and I've seen this myself because I like to smoke weed. And once you smoke, now it's in you. Now there's no longer the choice to be sober. You have to get through this. And so now, if you were at a point where you're like, I can go meditate and reflect on myself, or I can go talk to my wife, or I can go do something productive that I know I need to do, or I can drink half of this fifth of Jack Daniels, and then I'm not going to be good for anything. It takes the pressure off, right? Like
Right.
now I know I'm drunk, so there's nothing I can do. I have, for the next couple of hours, I'm off the hook. I think when you see that blackout behavior, that's kind of like the full circle of this desire to escape responsibility. Whatever that responsibility, at the end of the day, it's responsibility for our own progress, spiritual, social, whatever, however we conceive of success. And it's this way to sort of like rule that out. Now that's no longer in the cards. We have to go do the thing that we know is bad, but hey, we're in this state of mind now.
And I'm glad we kind of went deep into this, because normally I think when we first started this podcast, sometimes in these podcasts, I sometimes suggest a topic, or you suggest a topic, and we develop our thoughts as it's going along, right? So, at first I felt like addictive behavior is really revolved around not wanting comfort instead of dealing with catalysts. But there's also like a more subtle point, is in that it generally seems that addictive behavior also involves like not wanting to be responsible, which is a little bit slightly different than wanting comfort, right? It's not wanting to be responsible for,
I agree,
whatever.
It's the comfort of childhood, the comfort of things being simple, uncomplicated. Mom will always be there to give you lemonade. Dad will always be there to pull you out of whatever crap you get into. It is a I think that aversion to responsibility is heavily involved because responsibility is complex. And you know what? Even if we're responsible, sometimes we screw up. Sometimes we don't meet that. And that is just as important of a spiritual catalytic experience as acting on the responsibility successfully. We have to face the fact that if we try, we might fail.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on time. I actually think we hit a lot of the points, even though we weren't as organized as I set out to be. I think we actually hit on a lot of the points that that I had written down here.
It's funny because I always compile some notes before we record one of these things, and then 95% of the time I never look at them. I never use them. I really just it's almost like this homework that I did before to get me in the frame of mind. But this time I actually was able to look at these notes and go off of them. It's just interesting when we record a session that isn't centered on one transcript, but we're going off different things. Ryan and I used to do that a lot. So we just gotta mix it up, keep ourselves limber.
So as we're closing this out, kind of, do you have any other points you wanted to raise, or just some takeaways as to the contemplative listener who wants to maybe learn a bit more of how to recognize and handle and heal their own addictive behaviors?
Well, there was one thing about healing, and I don't know how powerful an idea this is, but it might be worth thinking about if one of our listeners is dealing with an addictive or fixated behavior that they'd like to change. And it's from a November 13th, 2010 Kuo session. They say, and they're asking about, what is this? The question is, I'm really touched by what you said, and this question is somewhat close to the boundary of free will, but I want to ask if one intends to keep the heart open, then is it usual for spiritual seekers or anyone perhaps to then sense or feel or if there is some sort of inner knowing that one is actually doing it and the heart is open. I guess I'm asking about either physical sensation or an inner knowing that one is walking on the path. So how do we like orient ourselves is how I see this. And Kuo says, in a way, what we are suggesting is a great deal like forming a habit. This instrument has read in articles about such things that a habit takes about 3 weeks to make, or perhaps 3 weeks to break. Those 3 weeks seem to be spent in failing to break that habit, wanting not to break the habit, yearning to go back to the old habit, and so forth. Yet if there is the intention set to break the habit, and there is a success in refraining from the behavior of the habit, gradually the mind becomes free to think of other things than the habit. The addiction has been downgraded, as the one known as Ken would say. They're talking about Ken Wilber, I believe. The addiction has been downgraded to a preference, and then the mind is free to take up a positive habit, where before there was a habit of which you did not approve. So I guess to bring it full circle is to recognize this is all involved from an archetypal point of view in perhaps the experience of body. If you look at that tarot card and you see the maiden closing the jaws of the lion, this is about coming into this relationship with these bodily mechanisms. Addiction is definitely a bodily thing that then gets exacerbated by the mind, in my view. But it's our bodies that want this comfort, that want this habit, that want this programming, that want to just follow a script. And so we can, that can be seen as a downside of embodiment, a downside of being incarnate in a biological sack of flesh. But I just want to say also that it can also be used for positive ends. We can build habits of meditation. We can build habits of expressing gratitude to others. We can become capable of building habits of exercise, and all of these things. We can use this script following tendency of our bodies for good things. And so instead of just looking at it as this morass of pleasures and nice things that we have to try to avoid because we don't want to be addicted to them, it's really about figuring out, like that first Hatan was talking about, how do we get addicted to the creator and the love and light? Because that's going to feed us. That's going to free us. Everything else, like David Foster Wallace said, is going to keep us in this trap where we're going to keep finding something that doesn't, we're going to keep searching for something that doesn't feed us. I guess that's where I'd like to leave it. And also, please reach out for help if you don't think that you can do this yourself. The body is difficult to deal with sometimes, and it's no knock on you or your polarity or your sincerity as a seeker or anything like that. If you need to reach and get a help of an expert, please do that. And if you don't want to do that, if you just need somebody to talk to, there's a contact form on our site, inaudible.show. I talk to seekers all the time. Reach out. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about it. And hey, even if you're not addicted, I'd love to hear from you. I know Nithin would too.
Absolutely. And, just the other things that I would just leave with the listener is, we've talked about this many times, the daily practice, specifically, there's many channelings on this, but I always like Ra's, which is the daily practice being one. And when we call it daily, certain aspects of this are daily, but a lot of these things can be done constantly. So exercise 1 is the moment contains love, right? And to really consciously try to see that love and try to understand your distortions and whatever is happening through that. Exercise 2, the universe is one being. When you view another mind body spirit complex, see the creator. 3, gaze into the mirror, see yourself and see the creator. 4, gaze at all of creation, like basically everything, inanimate objects, and see that as the creator. And then specifically, to have a predilection, is what Ross says, towards meditation, contemplation, or prayer. Because that way you can get down from the conscious mind to the deeper layers of your mind. Another specific technique that Ra talks about, and by the way, that is in what I just talked about was in session 10, question 14. Another great technique that I want to use more of is in Ra's session 41, question 21. You mentioned in the last session that fasting was a method of removing unwanted thought forms. Can you expand on this process and explain a little bit more how it works? I am Ra. This, as all healing techniques, must be used by a conscious being. That is, a being conscious that is ridding of excess and unwanted material from the body complex is the analogy to ridding the mind or spirit of excess or unwanted material. Thus, the one discipline or denial of the unwanted portion as an appropriate part of the self is taken through the tree of the mind, down through the trunk to subconscious levels, where the connection is made, and thus the body, mind, and spirit then in unison express denial of the excess or unwanted spiritual or mental material as a part of the entity. All then falls away in the entity while understanding, if you will, and appreciating the nature of the rejected material as a part of the greater self. Nevertheless, through the action of the will, purifies and refines the mind-body-spirit complex, bringing into manifestation the desired mind complex or spirit complex attitude. And just to mention once again, we've talked about this, so much of the path of polarity and just understanding this reality is understanding paradox, right? So on the one hand, you're refining and purifying yourself by, in a certain sense, rejecting certain aspects of the mind, but you still accept that it's a part of the greater mind, right? It's a very paradoxical kind of position. And Ra talks about this elsewhere. How can you reject the offering of a negative entity? A negative entity might offer you slavery. And, Ra says you should actually reject that in a certain sense because you couldn't maintain your own path. So it is a bit of a paradox, but a lot of these things, the deeper you go into this practice, you'll realize understanding and embracing paradox, understanding and embracing the opposite polarity of concepts, right? You can't have truth without falsity. You can't have beauty without ugliness. It's essential. And, the final thing I just want to leave with the viewer is, I've had many clients who did 12 steps, and I never really looked into 12 steps, right? Alcoholics Anonymous. But over the course of years and thousands of cases, occasionally I'd have to put on a hearing to convince the court that my client is truly interested in 12 steps. And, one of the things is I just have them on the stand and be like, recite the 12 steps. And that's what I actually was literally in the middle of the case. I started reading into this, and this is after I became spiritual. I'm like, actually, a lot of these 12 steps are actually very consistent with the daily exercises of the law of one, of what Ra specifically mentions, and really just a contemplative approach to your own catalyst. So just briefly, just to go over them. Admit that you were powerless over alcohol, that your lives had become unmanageable. So it's like recognizing the catalyst. Come to believe a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. It's, in a certain sense, understanding you have the individual self, but like the greater self, right? Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Once again, it's like seeing the creator, right? Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. It's digging deep into the catalyst, what you've done went through these addictive behaviors. That's you can't process something until you acknowledge all aspects of it, right? Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another being the exact nature of our wrongs, right? That's basically forgiveness, understanding. We're ready entirely to have God remove all these defects of characters. Once again, it's like praying for assistance, right? Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings, made a list of all persons we had harmed, and become willing to make amends to all them. I mean, these are things that I do when I process my catalyst. I'm like, oh, I hurt someone. So I thought it was fascinating that the AA talks about this. Made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Continue to take personal inventory and wherever we were wrong, promptly admitting to it. Sought through prayer and meditation. Literally, it talks about prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Once again, the archetypes talk about how we are a vessel for the one infinite creator. Having a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, carry this message to other alcoholics and practice these principles in all of our affairs. So I thought it was fascinating because I actually I never read the 12 steps up until well into my legal career and after I'd become spiritual. So there is there is help out there, and 12 steps I feel like a lot of people don't take seriously, and this is just purely from my experience with clients and also my analysis of the Law of One Confederation material. The 12 steps, now obviously I don't know any individual like organization and how it's actually practiced in the field, but conceptually these are very, very consistent with Confederation philosophy. And I think it's very useful to try these things out if you're struggling.
Yeah, it's easy for us to look at it in light of the philosophy and the teachings that we all adhere to, and to see the parallels. I think a lot of people oppose it because they don't like the legal system underwriting a Christian faith. But I think most people who are into the Law of One are less interested in adhering or rejecting a specific religious path, and are instead trying to find sort of technologies and approaches that can help them reckon with the energies and distortions within. So I hear where you're coming from.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for joining me on this Wednesday night. I appreciate it. And I'm glad you could join me for this conversation.
Yeah, we put off recording this a couple of times because I was afraid that we just didn't have enough to say. But as I see the counter at 1 hour and 15 minutes, I feel that we have created sufficient content. Oh God, I hate that word, content. Anyway, thank you, Nithin. Always a pleasure. Folks, we are going to continue to be recording podcasts. It looks like monthly has become kind of the norm. We just try to fit them in when we can, and the holidays are kind of a tough time to do it, but we're going to keep churning them out. You keep letting us know if we're hitting the mark or not, or what we can do to speak to your spiritual journey. We would love to hear about that. Inaudible.show is our site, and we have a contact form there. Let us know. Have a wonderful holiday, whatever you celebrate, and stay in the love and light.